You may have noticed that the vintage look is super hot right now. This is a great niche to consider getting into regardless of what type of products you make. We're going to be taking a look today on how to create vintage looking printable products so that you can get into this niche. The first thing we'll look at is what is the vintage look. We'll talk about where to find vintage images, where to find vintage fonts, and then at the end, we'll talk about techniques that you can use to make any image appear to be vintage, which is a great way to take products you've already made and apply some of these techniques to get a whole new vintage feel for the same product. First of all, why sell vintage? Obviously, I already mentioned that it's really hot. Everyone is wanting to buy vintage decorations and vintage products. There's lots of people that love kind of this style and are willing to pay top dollar for anything that they feel fits into the style. The defining characteristic of vintage is essentially something that makes you think about the past. So this could be actual vintage images, which includes public domain images. It could be vintage inspired images, vintage or vintage inspired fonts, and then it also kind of just is like faded or nostalgic colors, which is easy to achieve with a filter. Here's a great example of some vintage wall art. Etsy has a ton of vintage wall art available. This one specifically is 9 vintage European paintings. These are quite likely public domain works that maybe they've just adjusted the colors a little bit on. So this was super quick and easy to do. They just found images that they liked and downloaded them and did a few quick adjustments in a program like Photoshop or Canva. So where can you find these vintage images? There's 3 places that I am going to recommend: the Getty Images archival photos, the Smithsonian Institute, and historical stock photos. Let's take a look at each one of those in a little bit more detail. So Getty Images, the archival photos, it's huge. They've got over 5 million photos going back as far as the 1880s. You do have to purchase these images, but once they're purchased, you can use them for all your vintage printables. So buy once, use on everything. The second one that I recommend is the Smithsonian Institute. They've actually digitized their collection of images and they're all posted online. They are free, but you have to make sure that the image that you're using is available for commercial use. So you'll need to sort of select an image and then say, okay, what is the copyright on this image? Historical stock photos is the third one that I really love. It's a great resource. It's got thousands and thousands of vintage photos. Again, you do need to purchase them. And some of them have active copyrights. So you'll need to just check the copyright and see what you're able to do before you start using them. Now, if you're interested more in illustrations as opposed to photographs, there's 2 great sites for vintage and vintage inspired illustrations: the Letterform Archive and Free. The Letterform Archive has just a ton of vintage images. So some of these are like drawings, other ones are movie posters, postcards, other types of artwork. They have various paid membership options. So depending on how many images you think you need to use, you can check out the different subscription options there. The second one I love is Free Vintage Illustrations. So they've got just a giant amount of illustrations that you can use in your products. They are free to download, but again, always check the copyright on an image before you start using it. One great way to make something appear sort of vintage inspired, even if you're not going to change out the images, is to use a vintage font. 2 places that you can find lots and lots of vintage inspired fonts are 1001 Fonts and Font Space. All right, so how can you repurpose products you've already made into new sort of vintage inspired products? There's 3 really easy ways to do it. The first one is to use vintage filters. AI-powered filters can translate your images into the style of famous artists, or they can just sort of apply a vintage themed filter over the top. The second would be to use vintage colors by using AI tools to generate a new palette for you. And the third one would be to use aging effects to make new images and products look older. So you all know that I love Canva. Let's check out what Canva has. They have some really easy vintage filters. So here I am with just sort of a new blank Canva canvas. I selected a flower image, which doesn't appear vintage. It's quite bright. But if I go up here to the edit photo options, you'll see that Canva has a ton of filters. So I can scroll into the see all. And if I go down, I mean, anything here that you feel like makes it look vintage, that is kind of vintage looking, you could definitely do. But they actually have an entire set of vintage filters here that you can play with. So you can do these on any photo or any image that you have in one of your products, and you'll be able to make it appear more vintage. If you want to get some more ideas about creating various visual products, including plenty on creating vintage products, check out my product, PD Visual Prints. It tells you exactly how to create multiple streams of income with freely available and public domain content. Don't worry, you don't need to be a writer, you don't need to be a graphic designer. It's super simple. I give you all the checklists and video training you need to create your own vintage products and other types of products and have them ready for sale within the same day. It's perfect for people who want to use free and public domain content and printable products, people who want to create new vintage products with just a few mouse clicks, beginners, and advanced users. You can learn more about this product at my website, amyharrop.com, and that's PD Visual Prints.